If you're hearing this episode around the time it comes out, it means I'm taking some time off after the birth of my son. I've recorded these ahead of time and will most likely not be available on social media for the next few weeks. But you can still get the story behind twice a week if you're subscribed to the podcast. Consider this series to be like a substitute teacher. We won't go as in-depth as in previous episodes, but we'll briefly touch on a number of different topics in each show. The series focuses on Billy Joel's song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," and the headline-making events and people he mentions. Some content may not be suitable for all listeners. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind We Didn't Start the Fire, 1961 to 1963. Ernest Hemingway, Nobel Prize-winning author of For Whom the Bell Tolls, A Farewell to Arms, and The Sun Also Rises, was found dead July 1961 of a self-inflicted wound to the head by a shotgun his wife Mary had originally claimed he had been cleaning. It wasn't until months later that Mary admitted his death was a suicide. Adolf Eichmann was a former Nazi leader and was the organizer of Adolf Hitler's, quote, final solution of the Jewish question, which was the plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Eichmann was responsible for overseeing the coordination of identifying, assembling, and transporting Jews to concentration camps. He was finally captured in 1960 in Argentina and brought to Israel to stand trial. His 1961 trial was the first trial in history to be televised, and his defense was he was just following orders. However, the judge found him guilty of 15 charges brought against him, and in 1962, he was hanged. Stranger in a Strange Land was Robert A. Heinlein's science fiction novel about Michael Smith, who was raised by Martians and came to Earth with no knowledge of the culture. The book became largely popular with the counterculture of America, including those who identified with Smith's ideas about free love and commune living. The U.S. Library of Congress named it one of the 88 books that shaped America, and it's also been on a number of banned book lists. In one of the coldest winters, Bob Dylan arrived in New York City in December 1961. When he was let out of the car he was riding in on the George Washington Bridge, he walked 40 blocks to a cafe in Greenwich Village, where he met the club's MC, who offered Dylan a chance to play harmonica with him. From there, he made his way onto the music scene, bringing folk music to the forefront of popular music. Berlin, Germany found itself in the middle of Cold War tensions between the Russian-controlled East Berlin and West Berlin, which was controlled by the US, British, and French. In 1961, Soviets and East German authorities began sealing the free passage between the two parts, closing off access to the West. 2 days later, after an embargo was threatened, East German authorities began laying concrete in place of the barbed wire, and the Berlin Wall was erected, lasting for 28 years. It's interesting to note that We Didn't Start the Fire was released in July of 1989, and the Berlin Wall was torn down in November of that same year. We talked about Castro in the last episode, and in 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy signed off on an unsuccessful attack on Cuba with the intention of overthrowing him. Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but Castro was ready for the attack, and the exiles were either captured or killed. Lawrence of Arabia was a British-American biopic starring Peter O'Toole as the titular character of T.E. Lawrence, who struggles between his British heritage and his allegiance to the desert tribes of Arabia during World War I. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards in 1963, winning 7. While we probably all know who the Beatles are and don't need a refresher course on what Billy Joel was referring to with the line British Beatlemania, it's interesting to note that the first single released in Britain by the Beatles was Love Me Do in October of 1962, and by 1964 it became a #1 hit in America. But the British version and the American version differ, with the British single featuring Ringo Starr on the drums, while the American version features Andy White on the drums and Ringo Starr playing the tambourine. There's even a version recorded earlier when Pete Best was still the drummer, and that's available on the album Anthology 1. Ole Miss refers to the University of Mississippi admitting its first black student, James Meredith, but this didn't come about without controversy. When Meredith attempted to enroll, he was denied, causing chaos and riots on campus, leaving 2 dead and hundreds injured. It wasn't until Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy sent U.S. Marshals to enforce the Supreme Court decision in Meredith's favor that he was allowed to attend. He was the first African American to graduate from the University of Mississippi. In the spacecraft named Friendship 7, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, which he did 3 times. The former Marine test pilot was considered an American hero and went on to become a U.S. Senator and the oldest person to fly in space. Sonny Liston was one of the top boxers in 1962 because of his size and powerful punches. He was also said to be connected to organized crime. Even though heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson was warned not to fight him, he did anyway, and Liston beat Patterson out in what was the 3rd fastest knockout in boxing history. Pope Paul VI was the leader of the Catholic Church from 1963 to 1978. He was known as indecisive at times, but also progressive in his principles of mixed marriages. He was the first pope to visit 6 continents. Malcolm X came onto the civil rights scene in favor of separatism as opposed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideology of integration through peaceful means. Dr. King was critical of Malcolm X, including when, in 1963, he said he was not sad when President Kennedy was shot. In the following years, he began to change his views to wanting more economic and social equality for blacks. He was assassinated in 1965, and 3 members for the Nation of Islam were arrested and convicted of the murder. A politician had an affair, believe it or not. And I say that mockingly because, in this day and age, it rarely makes headlines anymore. But when British Secretary of State for War John Profumo was discovered to have had an affair with a showgirl and lied about it to the House of Commons, he was forced to resign. President John F. Kennedy traveled to Texas in November of 1963 with hopes of bringing Democrats together to carry the state in the next year's election. On his way to a luncheon in Dallas, riding in the presidential motorcade, crowds lined the streets to wave to him and the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. But when gunfire rang out at 12:30, Governor John Connally had been hit in the chest, and the president had been shot in the neck and head. At 1 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Lee Harvey Oswald was captured while hiding in a movie theater after fatally shooting a Dallas police officer and suspected of firing the sniper rifle that killed Kennedy from the 6th floor of a nearby building. Before being transported to the Dallas County Jail, Oswald was shot in front of police officers and a national television news audience by club owner Jack Ruby. And as Billy Joel ended this verse, what else do I have to say? Thanks for listening to The Story Behind. In the next 2 episodes, we'll explore the years 1964 through 1989, as referenced in Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. For more information, visit thestorybehindpodcast.com, and you can follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.